All these people doing really interesting work on these streamlined rear-engine cars. Now, what's interesting about the 356, it's very wet. People have been talking about how amazing old rear-engine Porsches are for pretty much ever. I'm not really qualified to do that because I'm just not that good a driver, if we're honest, and I think there's something more interesting to talk about when it comes to rear-engine Porsches. Porsche is the last company making a kind of rear-engine car that has its roots all the way back in the 1930s. If we look at cars like the Rumpler Tropfen Auto way back in the 19-teens and 1920s, which started it all with a rear engine, a streamlined design, backbone chassis, swing axles, and we go all the way through the Volkswagen era and up into the 60s when these cars had a resurgence, you'll see that the rear engine car had an amazing lifespan that started to die out around the 1970s or 1980s for pretty much everybody except for Porsche. So I'm going to drive 3 rear-engine Porsches today here at Sonoma Raceway. An old 356, this beautiful 901, and an amazing 959. And the whole time I'm going to be talking to you, yammering nonstop about the history of rear-engine cars and why Porsche still makes them today. So I'm in a Porsche 356 now, an early 50s speeder. And what I really like about the 356, and what's amazing to see when it comes to the idea of this old 1930s rear-engine air-cooled streamlined design, is this is the first development of that idea after the concept was proved by the Beetle. So if you look at a 356, there's a lot of really interesting things. Early ones were using mostly Beetle parts, but everything's a little different and a little bit better. Where the old Beetle design had no oil filter, just a strainer just to get the big chunks out of the oil, the big meaty oil chunks. This actually has a full flow oil filter system. And it's not choked anymore. The original Beetle had a carburetor designed to choke it for fuel efficiency reasons and engine longevity reasons. This time they actually put in twin carbs to really open it up and actually get some power out of the engine. Body-wise, it's also interesting because where the old Beetle had a very 1930s design, separate fenders, and a very narrow body, this was the first full-width body used on this kind of chassis. So you have like the pontoon fenders, and it's one kind of elegant piece that plops onto the tan. And this kind of design you actually see in the development work Volkswagen was doing for a possible Beetle replacement as early as the 1950s. Porsche designed some, and Michelotti and a couple other people actually designed Beetle replacements, and they all kind of look like the Porsche 356. It's really amazing, especially in that context. This is where they started to really believe in the rear engine idea and to think, hell yeah, we can do some fun stuff with it. And they absolutely did. So right now, I'm in a Porsche 901. Now, it's called the 901 and not the 911 because I don't know how big a Porsche geek you are, but very early on, the car was the 901, but Peugeot kind of had the lock on all car names and number names that had a 0 in the middle. So they asked Porsche to change the name, if you don't mind, and nobody says no to Peugeot, I guess. And so they decided, okay, we'll play ball, and they renamed it the 911. But this one's early enough that it's actually technically a 901. This car is interesting because it's basically that rear engine design. Again, that rear engine seed that started with Edmund Rumpler way back in the 19-teens and kind of really flowered in the 1930s. It's still that same concept, but it's modernized by 1960s standards, which means it's a unibody design, a monocoque design. The engine's a flat 6 instead of a flat 4. The interior is different, everything's different. We're not sharing parts really anymore with the Beetle. So it's all new, and it's really all new because right around the time this car was developed, in the early 60s, there was a renaissance for the rear engine car. Rear engine cars kind of grew up out of their 30s origins. The Beetle proved the concept. The Porsche 356 kind of showed how it could be developed, and then everybody wanted to jump on the bandwagon, and so we started to have all kinds of rear engine designs from all kinds of different car companies, like Fiat and Renault, Simca. In the UK, you had the Roots Group doing things like the Hillman Imp. Everybody was getting into the rear engine kind of idea. And what was great about it was all of the advantages of the old rear engine designs they learned in the 30s, the packaging advantages, the traction advantages, all those things, again, were real, but now we're with more modern techniques. This is an example of that old rear engine design through Porsche in this rear engine renaissance period of the 1960s. And they kept this design going all the way up until today. And the reason that they kept it going when really nobody else did has to do with the car that I'm gonna drive next. So the reason there's still rear engine Porsches today, the reason it didn't die off is all because of this car, the Porsche 959. Back in like the late 70s and early 80s, rear engine cars in general were kind of rapidly going away. Hardly anybody was still building them. Porsche and VW were still some of the few holdouts. Even VW, with all the technology they acquired from Auto Union and NSU, they were moving away from that. They moved to the Golf instead of the Beetle. Around the early 80s, it was basically just Porsche still mucking around with rear engine designs. And in fact, in 1981 was the planned date that Porsche was going to stop rear engine car development. No more 911. And they were going to focus on 924s and 928s, front engine rear drive cars, more conventional for that time sports cars. But the thing is, the people at Porsche didn't feel right about that. It wasn't a rational reason. They just loved the 911. After all those years, it was a tradition. So the 959 project was sort of a way to take the 911 design and update it for modernity, and boy did they do it. They crammed computers in this thing. It's got all-wheel drive that's computer controlled. It's got self-leveling suspension. It's got all the candy that modern sports cars have today, all the electronic goodies, but all developed at the same time back in the 1980s. This was kind of the template for all those things. And it was really an amazing project. It was such an amazing project, though, that Porsche was losing incredible sums of money on every 959 they sold. The development took so long, the Group B racing it was supposed to do kind of was gone by the time the car was actually ready to go. In a lot of ways, it was kind of a disaster, but it was also a triumph. They did manage to take the old rear engine design and modernize the shit out of it till it became a really viable and really competitive and pretty amazing car. This was the culmination of wanting something for non-rational reasons, but using every bit of rational thinking you have to justify it and to make it work. And they did. And that's why you've got rear engine Porsches to this day. You should all be very happy and thank the 959.